Hello Fearseekers, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be diving into some disturbing, allegedly true, Skinwalker horror stories. If you enjoy the content and want to help the channel grow, consider leaving a like and subscribing to keep up with future videos. Now without further ado, sit back, put any idea of sleep away, and get ready to ferment your fears. I am a 25-year-old male. I live in Utah, and I'm curious if any of you have seen anything like this before. I'm pretty sure I saw a Wendigo or a Skinwalker. I know it sounds strange or crazy. I don't really believe in those things, and I'm regularly skeptical when it comes to the paranormal. This happened to me when I was 17 and in high school and living with my parents. My house at the time was in a very small town. The backyard faced open empty fields and mountains for miles before you reached another civilization at all. My best friend lived next door and shared this field as our backyard in a way. I have to explain that this house was built on a different street that ended in the field with a small cul-de-sac. I think there was supposed to be more houses built down this street to expand the town, but they clearly never got around to it. So his driveway was basically in this cul-de-sac even though no other houses were built there. This matters later in the story. I used to stay the night at my friend's house a lot in high school because I didn't have the best relationship with my parents. Every once in a while we would wake up to hear dragging and a weird gargling sound coming from the back porch. His room was a basement room with the window well to the back porch. It would happen maybe a couple times a month, but whenever we would gather the courage to check, nothing would be back there. This happened for years. One night haunts my friend and I to this day. My friend was getting ready to move, and we would stay up all night playing games and watching movies. We decided to go on a music drive to just vibe. So we hopped in his truck with high beams and swung out of the driveway, turning them on towards the field to use the roundabout. The light illuminated this thing. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was naked on all fours, abnormally large, particularly its limbs that seemed to fold under itself in an unnatural way. Its pale skin clung to it like it had to be stretched onto it. But the part that still sends shivers down my spine is its face. Its jaw hung open to this gaping black maw, like a snake unhinging its jaw to eat. Its black eyes glistened in the night as it looked at us. But just as it turned to see us, it quickly scurried backwards, almost like it was on rewind into the brush of the field. My friend and I were pale as ghosts. We both looked at each other like, "Did you see that too?" We were shaken. Let's just say we tried to have a good rest of the night, but we couldn't believe what we saw. We ended up just sitting there in his basement with guns ready and waiting to hear the gargling and dragging again, but we never did. Sorry that it's not very climactic, but it's the truth. I now don't live in that town anymore. There are times when I visit there, though. That empty field still feels like it's watching and waiting. Even though I can't see it, I can still feel like it's out there. Hi, I'm CJ. I am Native American. Growing up, I was raised on my grandparents' land at the base of a mountain in a secluded part of Arizona, roughly 13 hours away from Phoenix. I lived with my parents, who were in their early to mid-30s. My brother was only 5 at the time, and my mother was pregnant with my little sister, who would be born at the end of the year. I got that typical lecture of staying inside at night, closing the curtains and locking the doors from my family. The house we lived in was owned by my maternal grandma. She allowed us to live there and allowed my parents to have a chance of raising a family until they were stable enough to have a home of their own. Anyways, on with the story. I was around 9 to 12 when this encounter happened. Like usual, we went through our nightly routine of locking the doors, closing the curtains, and even making sure the windows were locked. In the middle of the night, I was sleeping on the floor. My mother and my brother were on the bed, and my father was on the couch, all sleeping. Outside, I heard scratching on the walls and knocking at the doors. Where I lived as a child, nobody went outside after dark. As soon as I heard that, I got up to go look out the windows. When I looked out the bedroom window, I heard a familiar voice from the front door. It sounded like my grandma's sister, my great-aunt, but she had passed away when I was 6 years old. I thought she was back, but when I was making my way to the front door, I heard scratching and my great-aunt telling me to let her in. My father was hearing it too, but he knew that it was tricking me by using the nickname that my late great-aunt had given me. The floors of the house were extremely creaky, so my father knew that I was falling for it. So when he heard me, he told me as quietly as he could without alerting the creature that he knew what was happening. He told me to go back to the room as quietly as I could and to make sure that the window was locked. I did as he said. During that moment, fear and adrenaline were pumping through my body because I was a child who didn't know what was going on, just that it felt off. My father got up to call the medicine man to tell him what was happening and figure out what needed to be done. While he was doing that, the thing outside started to run around the house, banging and scratching the walls and even hitting the back door violently, just trying to get in. The medicine man told him to sing one of our prayer songs, but to be specific, he was told to sing the bear song, which is the most powerful song in our culture, and everyone knows not to mess with the bears. My father and I were up all night sitting on the living room floor, him singing and me doing the rattle. When the sun started rising over the mesas, the creature outside stopped and started to leave. We could still hear it mimicking my great-aunt's voice, saying my nickname from childhood that I had refused to let anyone else use since she died. Finally, the noises ceased and the creature was gone. My father went outside to see what damage was done, but all we found were footprints that didn't look right. Surprisingly, my mother and brother didn't wake up from the ruckus that had been happening throughout the night. To them, it was as if it never even happened. I have a story. It isn't mine, but it happened to my uncle. He used to tell this story when we went camping, and it scared the lights out of me every time I heard it. We live in Utah, and my Uncle Mark went on a mission at 19 for his church. They sent him to an Indian reservation in Arizona. They paired him with a companion named Carl. When they first got there, there was a huge rift between them and the locals on the reservation. They didn't want my uncle and Carl staying on the reservation grounds. Eventually, they came to a compromise that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. This reservation wasn't very big and was located next to a heavily wooded area. The first night, they were trying to sleep when all of a sudden their trailer started to shake violently back and forth. Startled and not sure what was happening, they climbed under their table for cover. Mark could distinctly hear someone pushing it from both sides of the trailer, like a group of people. After about 5 minutes, it stopped. The next day, they made rounds on the reservation and were talking to the locals. Carl made a comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking that night before. The family got very quiet and then told them they had to leave. They thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. The next night it happened again. They awoke to their trailer shaking back and forth. Again, they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them to leave. Mark started thinking that, due to the tension of their arrival, the locals were doing this to scare them off the reservation. They then went into a convenience store and they were talking together about how frustrated they were with the whole situation. The clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it. It's forbidden." Confused, they asked him, "Can't talk about what?" The guy continues to tell them about the Skinwalkers. He says they are evil demons that were once Native American witches. If they talk about it, the Skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out of there baffled. They thought it was just another scare tactic. So that night, when the shaking started again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door, threw it open, and yelled, "Hey!" When he did that, he saw 3 animals run off. 2 were wolves, 1 was a bear, but they looked strange, almost with human features. As he watched them approach the tree line, all 3 stood up on their hind legs and walked slowly towards the trees, making an eerie cackling sound. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president that next morning and asked to be moved. They were relocated that day, and for a year nothing happened. One day they announced that Carl was being relocated to another city and Mark was getting a new companion, Jimmy. They had to drive for about an hour to pick Jimmy up from the airport. The road they traveled went through the boundaries of the reservation. They arrived at about 8 p.m. As they were getting ready to leave, the mission president tells Jimmy, "We are driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy says, "I'm fine." The mission president gets serious enough to even freak out Mark. "I am not kidding. Go do your business." Jimmy was insistent he was fine, so they hit the road. About 30 minutes into the drive, as they were going through the area of the reservation boundaries, Jimmy started complaining that he needed to pee badly. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You'll have to hold it." Jimmy keeps going on. "I really can't hold it." So the mission president stops the car and says, "Okay, but you will do your business next to the door, and if I say get into the car, you better get into the car fast." With a look of confusion, Jimmy says, "All right." Opens the door and starts to do his business. About 5 seconds later, the mission president says nothing and just yanks Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy and Mark start freaking out. What is going on? The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car to his right. A giant wolf-looking man was running on its hind legs next to the car. Mark looked at the speedometer. They were going over 60 miles an hour and still increasing. The wolf creature kept right next to the car for 10 minutes until it finally took off into the trees. Shaking, Jimmy gets out of the car when they arrive. They didn't speak through the whole ordeal, and says, "What did I just see?" The mission president says, "Next time I tell you to take care of your business, you take care of your business." My cousin lived in the eastern agency of the Navajo Nation in a community known as Crown Point. She was still living with her parents at this time and was a good girl. She had good grades, a nice ride, and was a very popular girl that played on the basketball team. When she told us this story, it was very out of the ordinary, and the events that followed would also deepen my beliefs in the traditional Navajo way and of the taboos associated with the Navajo culture. My cousin was coming home from basketball practice, which ran past sunset. It was during the colder months, so it was dark by the time she pulled into her neighborhood. She pulled into the small housing community that she lived in. It was far from a fenced community, but there were street lights and the neighbors weren't too far from one another. As she neared her home, she saw a group of dogs. This wasn't unlikely, as there are random packs of stray dogs that roam rural communities. These dogs don't belong to anyone and they get food where they can get it. As she got closer, she noticed that something was off about the dogs. There were 4 dogs, and they were sitting in a circle all facing each other. This really didn't faze her until she spoke about the event later. Because this was a housing community, my cousin couldn't barrel down the road, so she slowly drove past the group of dogs and kept going on her way. As she continued to drive, she noticed in her peripheral vision that something was running alongside her car. she turned her head to see that a brown dog from the group was trotting alongside her car. She didn't mind much until she hit a strategically placed speed bump. The impact of the bump made her entire car wobble. She looked over at the dog again, still casually keeping pace with the car. She tried to ignore the dog and tried speeding up, keeping in mind where the speed bumps were placed. The dog continued to keep pace. My cousin had to eventually stop at a stop sign. She began to feel immensely uncomfortable and tried to keep her eyes forward, but curiosity got the best of her. She looked over at the dog. It was facing forward. She continued to stare, and that is when the dog turned its head. Instead of the face of a dog, there was the flat face of a man covered in hair and smiling from ear to ear. Fear shot through her body, and my cousin pushed the pedal to the floor, not daring to look back in her rearview mirror. She reached her house and barely pulled herself in the door, weak from fear. My aunt came to her and my cousin began to sob. She told my aunt everything and they scheduled a meeting with the medicine man the next day. That night, my cousin was trying to get some rest. She was tossing and turning and felt very ill. She could hear people outside laughing and talking in Navajo, but she didn't think too much of it because they lived in a community near plenty of neighbors. At the medicine man, he told my cousin that she was very fortunate. The Skinwalker wasn't meant for her. She just happened to spot it while it was out to bring another person misfortune. He also told her that the laughing and talking that she heard in the night was the Skinwalker talking to its friends, letting them know that someone had seen him and that he had scared her. The medicine man told my cousin that if the Skinwalker had been for her and she had seen him like that, it could have very well killed her. After that encounter, my cousin suffered from many ailments and had to stop playing basketball for a while. She had many ceremonies and eventually got back on her feet. My mom told us this story on the many nights that our electricity went out. When I asked my cousin about it, she confirms it's true, but doesn't like talking about it much. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. Have you ever had an encounter with the Skinwalker or other cryptid? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. If you have any stories you'd like to be narrated, be sure to send them in. Alright guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fearseekers. I'll see you in the next video.